Hi, I'm Jack Easthope, reg number 196363, and this is my biomechanics presentation in relation to skill acquisition, titled Overcoming Obstacles Through a Constraints-Led Approach When Coaching Olympic Weightlifting. So a constraints-led approach pioneered by Newell in 1986 suggests that constraints of the organism, task, and environment dictate coordination and control. A constraints-led approach is made up from ecological psychology and dynamic systems theory. Although for today's presentation, we will focus mostly on the constraints that belong to ecological psychology, theoreticalized by J.J. Gibson, and then the pioneered version of a constraints-led approach by Newell. So Newell's model of motor learning looked at coordination and control before enhancing skills. And he used a constraints-led approach to consider the external factors that affect the athlete from their environment, rather than just looking at the internal processing of their central nervous system. Today's presentation is specifically going to look at motor learning in relation to weightlifting. And some of the common errors that occur with weightlifting are listed on this slide. So it's really mostly about keeping a straight bar path and attaining vertical velocity. So keeping the correct spine alignment through different phases of the lift, ensuring triple extension patterns occur from the hips, knees, and ankles rather than ankles, knees, and hips, ensuring the pull works from the shoulders proximally to distally rather than pulling from the elbows, and ensuring that the displacement of the barbell and the jump is in a vertical direction rather than jumping forwards horizontally. So later on in this presentation, we will look at some of the constraints we can use with different types of equipment to help ensure we keep a vertical bar path and overcome some of these common errors. We will also look at some of the constraints within ecological psychology and how some of the misconceptions and stigma towards weightlifting can affect an athlete's intention and actions, leading to poor movement outcomes and poor skill acquisition. So ecological psychology is an embodied, situated, and non-representative approach to cognition pioneered by J.J. Gibson in the field of perception and E.J. Gibson in the field of developmental psychology. So that was taken from an article by Lobo, Heras, Isbriano, and Chavizo in 2018. So the constraints that live within ecological psychology are affordances, direct perception, also known as action-perception coupling, and Bernstein's degrees of freedom. So Newell categorized the constraints within ecological psychology into task, environment, and organismic. First and foremost, let's look at these constraints in their sections from ecological psychology and then see how these fit into Newell's categories later on. So an ecological approach processes that knowledge from the world is based upon recurrent processes of perception and action through which humans perceive affordances, opportunities for action, during sports performance. Silva et al. 2013. So affordances are opportunities for action, and they have a direct link to perception. Obviously, the way we perceive something will dictate the way we act upon something, and whether we can afford it or not will also dictate the amount of intent we put towards the exercise, also influencing our perception towards the exercise. So in relation to weightlifting, some of the affordances are listed on this slide. So ensuring we use the right barbell, the right footwear, using the right platform, chalk, clothing, and bumper plates, all things that can help us afford to attempt better movement patterns and in some respects, higher levels of weight, which would lead to better power output, less power leakage, and more efficient movement patterns. Capacities themselves, so strengths, mobility, flexibility, are an affordance. If you don't have a certain level of strength, you shouldn't necessarily attempt Olympic weightlifting, so it's always good to follow some of the prerequisites. Making sure you're mobile enough to drop under the bar and catch the bar in the right position without putting your body at risk, again, is another affordance. So direct perception, looking at the image on the left, we've got task, environment, and organism. And these will affect someone's perception. It will give them different types of information from those categories that will then affect their action, which is of course a movement, in this case, executing a snatch or clean and jerk, which then leads to a movement goal, which we will look at when in the task section of Newell's constraint-led approach. On the right are some other things that I've considered that may affect our perception. So the misconceptions and stigmas mentioned earlier. So some beliefs that Olympic weightlifting has too many time constraints, is too complex, and has a high risk of injury can lead athletes to attempting these movements with lack of intention and half-hearted. Although with the right manipulation of these constraints and the right coaching cues and feedback mechanisms, we can get rid of some of these complex ways of trying to teach these movements and get a much more smoother process. And as we do that, we can then change the misconceptions towards injury and get the athlete to put more intent into their movement, leading to better actions and outcomes. So degrees of freedom in relation to Olympic weightlifting kind of works for itself. So because you've got the derivatives, they naturally reduce degrees of freedom in the ankles and the knees to help increase the degrees of freedom in the hip. So a second pull, a shrug clean, a shrug snatch, hand cleans, hand snatches, all help focus on the hip extension part of the triple extension. This then leads to proximal to distal patterns, increase in force production and decrease in power leakage. Again, this would help with vertical velocity and a vertical bar path. I've also written down general strength and strength qualities, because we can use general strength exercises to reduce degrees of freedom, like a box squat or a rack pull, increasing movement patterns that coordinate more efficiently from the hips, knees, and then ankles, as well as we can use low load speed strength to help increase velocity, which is needed during Olympic weightlifting, even though it's high load speed strength, by chunking down movement and working with less complex movements or complex movements that need less intensity. So constraints emerge in decay, but we could also look at how other strength capabilities emerge in decay. So as a movement gets more intense, obviously the complexity increases. So we can decrease the intensity, we can increase the complexity, and then go back to increasing the complexity, hopefully with a little bit more intensity than previously before, due to our intention mentioned previously in the direct perception slide. So looking at the tasks of Olympic weightlifting. So the goal task is about displacing the barbell from A to B, from the floor to overhead, either in a snatch in one direct movement, or looking at the clean and jerk in two serial skills. We also want to lift as much weight as possible, because in competitive weightlifting, the winner of the contest is the person who can lift the most of the two lifts contested, the snatch and clean and jerk. Although in sports performance, we also want to make sure we increase strength, rate of force development, power, and in some respects, endurance, which I'll come to later. We want to ensure vertical velocity and vertical displacement. As well as the goal, we also need to look at the rules and the equipment used in relation to attaining the task of a snatch and clean and jerk of weightlifting. So let's look at the rules. So these are taken from British weightlifting, and some of them are some of your baseline rules. So making sure a hook grip is permitted, chalk can be used. In competitive weightlifting, the snatch must be executed first. Only lifters and loaders can move the bar. Bar must be released in front of the body, and the grip can be released once the barbell past the shoulders. Another consideration towards rules is the technical model. So the most efficient movement and the most skillful movement will be as close to the technical model as possible. Of course, through attaining movement outcomes, we don't always use the exact technical model, and we can still displace the barbell vertically from A to B in a way that may be very far from the technical model. Equipment. So looking at the lady on the picture here, she's using agility poles. And what this will do, it will help with the vertical displacement and prevent the lady jumping forward, which would result in horizontal displacement of the barbell. Other pieces of equipment that can help with the lift are varied loads, weighted vests, footwear, suits, chalk, cliffs, and blocks. So a lot of the equipment category is based from affordances and direct perception and even degrees of freedom, because these constraints or with equipment are going to manipulate degrees of freedom, they're going to change the athlete's perception, and they're going to be an affordance in their own right. A couple of other pictures here. So the varying loads, we could maybe do some first pulls and second pulls with a heavy weight to then make the full movement easier when we work with a lighter weight. The cliff in front of us will stop the athlete from jumping forward, which should ensure more vertical velocity, like mentioned earlier. So using the right equipment, using these constraints and different methods of derivatives, we can then work towards the goal task without breaking as many rules or deviating too far away from the technical model. In relation to Olympic weightlifting, there's not too much in the environment that we can manipulate. So we can use derivatives to change the start position. We can make sure we use the most efficient gyms of weightlifting that allow us to drop the barbell from height if needs be, or even attempt a lift which we might fail. We might be able to control the music to drown out some sounds and white noise around us. But there's some of the physical things we can manipulate. In relation to social manipulation, we could make sure we've got in the right environment and have the right support from our peers. We could set internal in-house competitions and maybe set things like a PB board to help motivate and inspire the athletes to keep pushing and attempting heavier loads. So the quote here from Stone et al. 2006 states that weightlifters are generally mesomorphic and shorter than usual athletes at the same weight with lower body fat. So soma types, training age, strength levels, fitness and fatigue focus intent are all organismic constraints that we can manipulate to try and improve movement outcomes and performance characteristics. These generally take a lot longer to change. So increasing an athlete's strength will help attain better movement patterns, managing their fitness, increasing their fitness and managing their fatigue, giving them better focus and attention are all things we can change over time, whereas the constraints in relation to affordances and equipment and perception are usually quicker interventions we can make to attain movement outcomes. So I want to finish this with a slide going back to Newell's motor learning. So through manipulation of these constraints belonging to ecological psychology, we can improve coordination and control. From here, we can start challenging our movements through external loads and unstable platforms and different positions and variations of the movement to enhance skill further. As we do this, naturally, we should get more efficient at some of the simple movements that we first start to work with. Finally, the last slide is a slide full of references, which I used to help construct this presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it. Many thanks. Goodbye.